Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning to the Dupont Water Solutions Academy. Today's speaker is Donna DeFlavis Murphy and her guest, Marcus Lack. And they'll be talking about Ion Exchange Resins 101, Part 1, Resins and Their Properties. We hope you enjoy this free webinar program and make the most of the engagement tools by downloading your certification of attendance, making questions, and sharing your feedback with us. This year, we are launching the Super Certificate Program. So if you attend all webinars of a series, you are eligible to get one mailed to your office. This webinar, for instance, is the first of the industrial series. So don't forget to register for the upcoming ones by clicking the URL icon in the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, let's take a minute for general housekeeping. You can access all engagement resources from the bottom of your screen by simply clicking on the colored icons. And you can resize and move them around as you wish to best fit your screen. We'd love to hear from you, and the best way to raise your questions or comments is the Q&A box on the lower left corner. We'll take questions during this presentation and address them in the Q&A session at the end. If your question is longer or you'd like to have a more personal response afterwards, you can do that with the purple Email Us button. To earn a printable course certificate, you just need to make for the first 20 minutes of this webinar. Now, back to our topic, and I'm happy to introduce our speakers. Donna DeFlavis Murphy is our Technical Service Manager for the Industrial Water Market segment at Dupont Water Solutions in North America. In this role, Donna supports Ion Exchange Resin technology for the business. She works closely with customers to deliver product recommendations, consultations and training seminars, troubleshooting and system design projections, and collaborates closely with the R&D and manufacturing on the development of the new products. Donna is also an advisory council member for the International Water Conference. Marcus Lack is also a technical service manager for the Industrial Water Market segment at Dupont Water Solutions in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So Donna and Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, Donna. Thank you so much for the invite for me to be present at the webinar today. I will try to deal with as many questions as possible that will pop up during your talk, and I'm really looking forward to hear what you are going to talk about.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to have you here, and I'm so happy to have your expertise on the call with me today. And thank you, Laura, for the nice introduction. Okay, let's get started. So, as Laura mentioned, today's webinar is going to be discussing ion exchange resins and their properties. This is part one of a two-part webinar. The second part is going to be talking about how ion exchange resins work and the factors that affect performance. So I hope you can join us next Thursday for part two. And if not, the webinar will be recorded so you can listen in at your convenience. Today, we're going to break our topics into two sections. The first, what is ion exchange, the composition of the beads, how they're made, the different types of resins that we have. And the second part is going to be discussing more of the properties, the chemical and physical characteristics, those properties that you're most likely to see on the product data sheet. And we're also going to be discussing some properties that are important as well, but you may not see on the product data sheet. But before we begin, I wanted to get a little information from you about what was your primary motivation for attending this webinar today. So if you would kindly just take a second and select the reason why you're attending this webinar today. Is it number one, I'm trying to get credits for continuing education, or two, I have an ion exchange system and wanted to learn more about it, or three, I am thinking of installing an ion exchange system in my operations and wanted to learn more about it, or the last one, you were just curious and wanted to learn about the topic. Okay, and let's take a look and see what the results are. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing some information about yourself today. And no matter what the reason is that you're calling into this webinar, I hope that you'll find some useful information. Okay, let's get started with our first section. What is ion exchange? So let's define what ion exchange is. It's defined as the reversible exchange of ions between a solid and a liquid in which there's no substantial change in the structure of the solid. If you look down at the center of your screen, the example that I'm going to give is of a cation resin bead. So in this case, our solid that we're talking about is our polymeric cation resin bead. And the exchangeable ions are hydrogen and sodium in this example. So this is a D-min application that we're showing here, and the resin starting out in the hydrogen form. And as water with cationic or positively charged contaminants pass through this resin, the hydrogen will be displaced for other ions that the resin prefers, such as sodium. And you can see an example of this in action. There we go. And as the resin will continue to do this, and as it exhausts, we stop and we regenerate this resin with acid, which allows us to put the hydrogen back on the resin so that it is ready for the next service cycle to remove even more contaminants. Now, another thing I wanted to point out here about the polymeric resin beads, if you look up in the right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little diagram. So I already mentioned the polymeric bead structure, but there's stationary active groups that are permanently attached to chains, these polymeric chains that run throughout the bead and on the bead surface. And these mobile counterions interact with these stationary active groups. So hydrogen and sodium in this example. Another thing I wanted to point out is that water, which is important in this application, the resin bead actually contains about 50% water, and that's necessary for the transport of these ions to get from active site to active site and into and out of the bead. Okay, so let's talk about what the resin beads are made of. And almost all of the resins in the industrial water market, or I shouldn't say all, I should say 85%, which is a large portion, are made of styrene. About 10% of the resins have an acrylic polymer bead structure, and we also have a phenol formaldehyde chemistry. We add cross-linking to these beads with a compound called divinyl benzene. And in the top right-hand portion of the screen, I'm showing pictures of styrene divinyl benzene copolymer. So on the right-hand side, you can see the structure of the styrene and the divinyl benzene monomers. So we polymerize these together and make long chains of styrene that are cross-linked with divinyl benzene. Now, we vary the level of DVB in the products to get different effects. So if we want to have certain properties, we may add more or less DVB to the copolymer. And production of these copolymers is very important because it affects the physical properties of the final product, such as bead size and bead strength. You can see on the square on the lower right-hand portion of the slide many of the different properties that can be affected by having increasing levels of DVB. And some of these properties we will be discussing later on in this webinar. We offer resins with two different types of polymer matrices, a gel matrix or a macroporous matrix. Let's look at the gel resin on the left-hand side of your screen. If you look at the micrograph, you see a very smooth surface to this resin. And if you were to look at it under an optical microscope, you would see that the resin is translucent. This resin has very low porosity. The only pores are the space between the polymer chains, which is only about 5 to 15 angstroms. This resin, though, has a very high capacity and very good regenerability. On the other hand, there's the macroporous resin. This resin has a lot of porosity. If you look at the micrograph below, you can see a lot of nooks and crannies. There's a lot of surface area there. And we obtain this by using a compound called porogen that locks in void space, creating these macropores, which is excellent for removing large molecular weight compounds. Now, if you were to look at this under an optical microscope, you would see an opaque bead, and that is because these large pores diffract light. We make our copolymers by two different processes. One is a suspension polymerization, and the other is a direct jet polymerization. These processes result in product with different bead size uniformity. On the left-hand side, I'm showing a suspension polymerization. And in the micrograph, you can see that the beads are of various sizes. We refer to this as a Gaussian particle size distribution. On the right is a direct jet polymerization. All the bead sizes are very uniform, and we refer to this as a uniform particle size distribution, or UPS for short. On the top right of your screen, you can see an overlay of the particle size distribution for each type, for the Gaussian and the uniform. We're going to talk more about particle size later on in the webinar. Once the polymeric beads are functionalized with their active groups, this determines what types of resins they become. There's two basic categories: cation exchange resins, which remove cations or positively charged species, and anion exchange resins, which remove anions or negatively charged species. The resins that I have listed on the slide here are common resins that are used in industrial water applications. On the left-hand side, the strong acid cation resin has a sulfonic acid functional group. This is a strong acid. It will remove all positively charged species. The weak acid cation resin is a carboxylic acid functional group. When this is in the hydrogen form, it's only going to remove those cations that are associated with alkalinity. The weak acid cation resin in industrial water applications is sometimes used in conjunction with the strong acid cation resin to improve chemical efficiency. This is in waters that have high hardness to total cation ratios. The weak acid cation resin can also be used alone in high TDS softening applications. Here it's used in the sodium form. When it's in this form, it will remove all hardness and not just that which is associated with alkalinity. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the anion exchange resins. There's two strong base anion resins that I have listed. The type 1 is the most common SBA that's used in industrial demon applications. And this is because it has a high affinity for silica. And most demon applications have tight silica specifications. The strong base type 2, which is also a quaternary ammonium ion, has a bulkier side chain than the type 1 anion. And this reduces that positive charge on the nitrogen, making this resin easier to regenerate than the type 1. However, it also makes it hang on to silica less tightly than the type 1. And so for this reason, that's why the type 1 is preferred. Also, the type 2 resin has a temperature sensitivity. So at 35 C, you can't use this above that temperature. So it also limits its use in industrial water. However, if you have a water that and that's below 35 C, and you don't have a tight silica specification, you might want to investigate using a type 2 strong base anion resin. The third resin, anion resin that I have listed, is a weak base anion resin. You'll notice that there's no positive charge on this nitrogen. This is a tertiary amine, and this resin isn't your typical ion exchanger. It is, I would consider it more of an acid adsorber. Weak base anion resins can be used in conjunction with strong base anion resins to do two things. One, to provide chemical efficiency, just as in the cation resins. But also, weak base anion resins can remove organics and elute them very well compared to a strong base anion resin. So it can provide protection from organic fouling for the strong base resin. Most of the resins that I'm discussing today are industrial water resins, but there are many other applications that ion exchange resins are used. Even within water treatment, industrial water treatment, there's a lot of applications from softening to demineralization, condensate polishing, ultra-pure water production. But there's also other applications on the process side of things where it might be used in a food or farmer application. It could be used in a chem process application or other applications. And so I wanted to just point out that there may be other types of resins that I'm not discussing here. And if you have an interest in these certain applications, please look out for webinars on our Process Academy and also our Fossil and Nuclear Power Academy webinars. So they'll offer more information on these different types of applications. Or you can just reach out to our website where we also list recommended resins for various applications. And the link should be attached to the webinar information section. Now we're going to move to the second half of our webinar that's going to discuss the chemical and physical characteristics of the resins, the properties that you might find on a data sheet, and other useful information. We already started discussing particle size earlier in the presentation, but I wanted to start with this property and provide a little more explanation. I've mentioned Gaussian particle size distribution and uniform particle size distribution earlier in the webinar, and I just wanted to talk about how we measure the uniformity, and that's through a uniformity coefficient. And this is most of the time on the product data sheet. It's not all of the time on our product data sheets. We usually call out the resin as a Gaussian particle size in the description. However, if it's not in the description, you can tell by the uniformity coefficient. Uniform particle size resins generally have a 1.0 to 1.15 uniformity coefficient, whereas Gaussian resins are around 1.6. There are narrow particle size distributed resins, which could be a screened form of Gaussian resins, where large and small particles can be removed, and that will have a uniformity coefficient somewhere in between. And so let's take a look at two examples here. The top is a Gaussian particle size distribution, and the bottom is a uniform particle size distribution. And if you look at the bead size range going across, you'll see that in the top example in the Gaussian, we have particles present in very broad, and the typical range for that is around 300 microns to over 1,000 microns. So you'll see small and large particles present at significant volume percents there. Whereas if you look at the uniform particle size range on the bottom, that is much narrower. And the typical range for that is around 600 microns plus or minus 50. that you'll see. And the way the uniformity coefficient is calculated is you take the screen size or particle size where that passes 90% of the resin, and you divide that by the screen size or particle size that passes 40% of the resin. And that is the definition of the uniformity coefficient. Now, why does this matter? Why does uniformity matter? So it's especially important in certain ion exchange applications where you need to maintain a separation of two different resins, such as in mixed bed applications or layer bed applications. It also matters in applications where you have flow distribution systems that are more sophisticated than a co-flow distribution system. And we'll explain more about recommending different resin types for different ion exchange technology in a later webinar in May that deals specifically with ion exchange technology. Other particle size definitions that you might come across are the effective size, and that's where 90% of the volume of beads are retained, sometimes referred to as the D10, or the volume mean diameter, which is where 50% volume of the beads passed, and that is the D50. The change in resin volume with ionic form. This is a property of the ion exchange resins that you don't want to take you by surprise. It is commonly listed on our product data sheet as % expansion or % swell, this is a property of the resin that anyone who is either purchasing resins for use or designing ion exchange systems should be aware of. In some cases, the expansion can be quite large, such as in a weak acid cation resin. You can get an expansion 60 to 90% depending on what type of resin that you're using and how you're using the resin. Or it could be quite small, like in a strong acid cation resin going from the sodium to hydrogen form, which is about a 7% expansion. So this definitely is a property to be aware of, and it's an important one. The total exchange capacity is the number of active sites that are available on the resin with reference to a specific ionic form. This is usually expressed as a volume unit. So you may see equivalents per liter, and in parentheses, the form like sodium or hydrogen if this is a cation resin. Another way of expressing this is by weight, and this unit is not so common, but you may see it here and there as equivalents per kilogram, and that is a dry measurement. So on the bottom of the screen, in those two blocks, you can see the cation, typical examples of cation exchange resin capacities, as well as on the right, the anion exchange capacities. And you'll note that they're different depending on what the form is. So for a gel, you may have 2.0 equivalents per liter in the sodium form, but only 1.85 equivalents per liter in the hydrogen form. And since this is a volume reference, this is because of what we talked about in the last slide, the previous slide, and that resins have a change in volume. So we're looking at in 1 liter, how many equivalents we would have. And so in the hydrogen form, the resin is going to be the most swollen. And in the sodium form, it's going to shrink. And so you can fit more beads in a liter in the sodium form than you can in the hydrogen form. And so that is why it appears larger, more equivalents per liter in the sodium than it appears for the hydrogen. Also, I wanted to point out with strong acid cation resins, as you increase in the percent DVB, remember that's our cross-linker that we're using for our styrene DVB resins. As you increase in percent DVB, you're going to get an increase in the wet volume capacity of the resin, or the equivalents per liter of the resin. Okay, let's talk about another type of capacity that the resins have, and that's the ability to hold water. We call this the water retention capacity. You may have also heard it called moisture holding capacity, but basically it's how much water the resin holds on to. And so after the resin copolymer is made and the resin becomes functionalized, then it starts to take on water. And the amount of water that it takes on, because it has become hydrophilic, it really depends on the functional group that was added, the ionic form that it's in, how many waters of hydration are associated with that, also the percent DVB level. You can see in the chart on the right for cation and anion resins that as we increase the divinyl benzene level, we increase the cross-linking of the copolymer, that the resins don't take on as much water. That water retention capacity actually goes down. So it's a measure of the tightness, I guess you can say, of the resin as well. And it's an important parameter for resin analysis of cation resins. The water retention capacity for strong acid cation resins is a measure of those cross-links. And so when resins are exposed to different oxidants, the water retention capacity, we see an increase because those polymer chains are breaking due to oxidation. And so the water retention capacity, it's an important parameter that we measure in the production of our resins, as well as when we're evaluating used resins. Ion exchange resins go through a lot of stress during their lifetime under normal operations. They may experience chemical or physical stressors that could cause mechanical failure. So before we introduce a resin to the market, we put it through a number of different tests to make sure that it will hold up for its intended application. So to investigate whether a resin is going to be able to withstand the pressures that are exerted on it in the resin bed from delta P, for example, we'll do a friability test where we put single beads under a piston and compress them until the breaking point. And that'll measure the force that's needed to break that bead. Also, we have an attrition test because beads have shear forces exerted on them from one another when they go through backwashing and resin transfer and air cleaning and scouring. They're going to be experiencing these things. So we have an attrition test where a slurry of the resin is passed through an impeller. And we then count the number of broken and cracked beads. We also want to look at the osmotic shock that a resin goes through. As the resin goes through regeneration and service cycle, it can shrink and swell over time and experience these osmotic stressors. Also, if a resin is going to be used in a mixed bed application, it might have the chance of seeing caustic sometimes and then seeing acid if there's any cross regeneration that's occurring at the interface. So we want to make sure that these resins can hold up in those applications. So we have osmotic shock testing where we're cycling acid and bases multiple times to see how the resin holds up, all to test the mechanical stability properties of each resin to ensure the integrity of these resins for their intended applications. In addition to mechanical stability, I wanted to talk about the thermal stability and the oxidative stability of resins in the next couple slides. So resins can degrade thermally, and they can also degrade through oxidation, as we'll see. All resins aren't the same when it comes to thermal stability. For example, if you look at the chart on the top right of your screen, strong acid cation resins are much more thermally stable than anion resins. They can withstand up to 120 C in the hydrogen form before there's going to be any effects of degradation there. Also, strong base anion resins, even weak base anion resins, you can assume that 60 C in the regenerated form is a temperature that you don't want to exceed when it comes to anion resins. And if you have a strong base type 2, or if you have an acrylic resin, it's even lower than that. We don't recommend going above 35 C in the regenerated form. Now, in the exhausted form, these resins can withstand higher temperatures, but if you're using them in demon applications where they will be in the regenerated form, like the hydrogen or the OH form, then you're going to have to be aware of these temperature limitations to get the most lifetime out of the resins. So, cations can degrade through the loss of their functional groups, but anions degrade in a slightly different way, where they will be converting, if you have a strong base resin, that can convert some of the strong base groups into weak base groups, which it will still work as far as removing mineral acidity. However, it might have a loss in the silica capacity. Also, they could also degrade through the total loss of the functional group as well. Resin analysis is a good way to check the health of these resins, to be able to see what's going on and if they have been degraded at all. So again, anion resins are not, don't have a high level of thermal stability, so care always needs to be taken with regeneration temperatures to get the most lifetime out of your anion resins. Ion exchange resins can undergo oxidative degradation, so it's really best to remove any free chlorine or other oxidants upstream with pretreatment if possible. In the top right-hand corner, I'm showing some of our recommended limits for free chlorine that each type of ion exchange resin can tolerate. However, if you do happen to have some excursions that you know are going to occur and are going to be higher than this, then for strong acid cation resins, for example, there are some things that we can do, like recommend a more oxidatively stable resin. So something with more higher cross-linking, maybe a 10% gel resin instead of an 8% gel cation resin. Or in some cases, we might move to a macroporous resin depending upon the level. So, so consult with your tech service ion exchange person if you think you're going to have excursions higher than our maximum, to make sure that you're using the right resin for your level of oxidation. Why do you want to do that? So let's talk about what can happen to the resin if it's exposed to free chlorine. Strong acid cation resins, the structure is actually going to be attacked. So those polymer chains are going to be breaking. It can throw TOC down to your downstream anion and start to cause issues down there with potential surface fouling. So it's best to make sure that you're actively monitoring this. If you have free chlorine in your system with frequent resin analysis. We can see this in the water retention capacity increase in the resin that it's experiencing oxidation. So it's best to stay on top of that. Now, the anion resins, you can see from the chart that they're more sensitive. We have lower limits for these. These will be, however, protected by the strong acid cation resin that's in front of them somewhat as far as free chlorine, but they could get hit with the degradation products that may cause some issues. If they are exposed to free chlorine coming in through the caustic or another source, then they could experience some loss of exchange sites. And this, in a weak-base anion, could also actually be oxidized down to some carboxylic acid capacity, which is not a good thing to have in your anion resin because you're going to hit that with caustic, and that's the little weak acid cation exchanger, so it's going to pick up sodium and release it upon rinse, so you could have long rinse out. So oxidative degradation is not a good thing, something to stay on top of. We can do some things with higher levels of DVB, cation resin, but they all are going to be susceptible to oxidative degradation. So that is all the information I have today on ion exchange resins and their properties. I hope you found it informative, and we can now take some time for your questions.
Thanks for the great presentation, Donna. That was a very good overview on resins and their properties. We invite you all to stay around for 10 more minutes, as now we're going to have a Q&A session with Donna Murphy and her guest, Mark Slack. For the ones asking if the presentation is going to be available, the answer is yes. You can always access this content on demand. You receive a link by mail right after this webinar. We also post in our website at dupontwatersolutions.com/academies. Just go to the webinar library page. Okay, let's move on here so we can try to answer as many questions as possible live. First one I have is for our guest, Mark. Why do resins swell and shrink, and why do I need to know? That's for you, Mark.
Well, Laura, that's a good question. I think the best way to explain that is to link it to an example. For instance, a cation resin. A cation resin in the active form is in the hydrogen form. But the hydrogen in the resin is not just there as an H ion, it's there in a hydrated form. That means it's surrounded by water molecules. The same for the ions that are in the water that we try to capture with the resin. So let's take sodium as an example. Sodium is not only there as Na+, it's there as Na+ surrounded with water. And sodium is less hydrated, has less water molecules around it. So when it's captured by the resin, the hydrogen will be placed to the water and the sodium is bound by the resin. That means that the hydrogen takes more water out than that the sodium is bringing inside the resin bead. With that, we lower the amount of water in the resin, and because of that, the resin will shrink. Now, that is important to know, because you can imagine if you have a vessel and you fill it up with a cation resin, a strong acid cation resin in the sodium form, and you would expose that to an acid, you will convert it from the sodium to the hydrogen form and increase the hydration, and because of that, the resin will start to swell. Now, the resin will not collapse. The resin is extremely strong, but what will collapse or deform is your vessel. So you can imagine a good understanding of how resins act when they change chemical form is critical if you operate a system or if you're handling a resin.
Thank you, Mark. Very detailed answer. As we have you on, let's go to another question for you. We need to do air score cleaning every month. What will be the effect of that on the resin?
Air scoring or air cleaning, so the use of air, typically in ion exchange systems, is part of common practice, common operation. We need air. We need air to mix resins in a mix bed, or sometimes we need air to clean the dirt off the resin bead. So using air as such is not something that can damage the resin, but if you would ask me theoretically, will it do nothing to the resin? No, it will do something. It will create forces because the resin beads are rubbing against each other when we do this air treatment. And if you do that a lot, if you do that, for instance, multiple times a day, yes, then the attrition forces will damage the resin. But that is exceptional. Under normal circumstances, the use of air will have no effect on the lifetime or the quality of our resins.
Good, thank you, Mark. Now another one here that either of you can pick up. My demine system uses chloramine instead of free chlorine. Is that better for the ion exchange resin?
Sure. Excuse me, I can take that one. Unlike the case of free chlorine where the cation resin takes the brunt of the attack and the downstream anion in a two-bed system remains somewhat protected, we do have evidence that with chloramines, this can cause both damage in both the cation and the anion because it acts, has a different mechanism for the reaction. So our recommendation is that if you've actually have switched from a chlorination to now using chloramines, then we would recommend a review of your upstream pretreatment to make sure that you're removing these oxidants because they can damage not only the cation resin but also the anion resin.
Thank you, Donna. One more here. The free chlorine level in my feed water is within the limitations you showed. Does it mean nothing will happen to my resin?
Well, let me take that one. It is a bit linked to what Donna just answered. Oxidants are a very actual topic. We get a lot of questions about that. And yes, we have issued guidelines saying each resin should not be submitted to more than a certain amount of oxidants. But that doesn't mean that nothing will happen. The only problem is that it's hard to quantify, and people very often want to know how much they will lose in terms of resin lifetime. The oxidants and the effect of oxidants is, for instance, influenced by temperature or is influenced by the time that it's exposed to the oxidant. So it's more than just the level of oxidants. And the best answer is what Donna already said with the previous question, is to try to avoid it or use a reducing agent like bisulfite to eliminate the effects of oxidants in the water. That's the best way to extend the resin lifetime and to secure the performance of the resin in your system.
Thanks, Mark. We have time for two more questions. So first, I have issues with organic fouling on my anions. I heard drying treatments can help. How long will that last? I'm sorry, the question was, I heard drying treatments can help. How long will that last? So either you, Donna, or Mark can.
Okay, sure. I can take this one. So that's a tough one to answer because the answer is it depends. It's going to depend on how much organics you have in your feed and how much water you're treating between regeneration. So how much organics are you actually loading onto the resin? Excuse me. Brine treatments are good at removing organics from the resin. And we recommend actually monitoring your rinse downs. So when anion resins are fouled, they typically have extended rinse down times when you're trying to rinse into conductivity after regeneration. After the brine squeeze, you should see an improvement in that. And if we often get questions on how often these will last, and that's going to vary. So if you monitor the rinse downs and you look at how long, when it starts to extend again, it's time for another brine squeeze. And after a certain number of these, you'll get a feel for the frequency that's needed. And if you want to stay ahead of it, sometimes catching it before it gets to very long extended rinse downs is helpful. There's other things that you can do if brine squeezes are not working for you. You can look at different types of resins, like an acrylic strong base anion resin is really good at releasing organics on regeneration. However, it's not suitable for all systems because of its temperature sensitivity. Also, you might want to consider adding a scavenger resin as well. And we're going to actually have a webinar later on this year that deals with organics and the best way to deal with them. So we'll have a lot more information in a longer period of time to discuss this. A lot of people have this question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Now to our last question. The product data sheet says that a cation can withstand 120 degrees Celsius. Does this mean nothing happens to the resin if I stay below that number?
Yeah, I will take this one. If you look to temperature, as Donna explained in the presentation, each resin has a certain limit that's mentioned on the PDS. Now, this number is given to avoid that you use a resin outside limits where it would basically collapse. Now, similar to limitations to oxidants, if you submit them to temperatures so let's just assume the limit is 120, you would submit them to 100 degrees C. Would that mean that nothing would happen to the resin? No, the answer is no. Resins exposed to higher temperature will change. They will age faster at higher temperature than they do at lower temperature. So the higher the temperature you submit them to, the lower the lifetime you can expect from the resin. And at those high temperatures, that kind of degradation rate is quite high. And as Donna also explained, if a cation resin is starting or suffering from thermal degradation, it will release the active groups. So that means that acids are added to the water. So doing that, so using resins at high temperature, you need to take special care how to do that and how to manage that.
All right, thank you, Mark. With that, we wrap up the Q&A session. Donna and Mark will address offline any questions that could not be answered live. Thank you again so much to our presenter today, Donna De Flavis Murphy, and her guest, Mark Black. We hope to see you next Thursday for the part 2 of this webinar, Ion Exchange Resins 101, Operations and the Factors that Affect Performance. If you haven't done so yet, you can register using the URL button in the right bottom corner of the console in front of you. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to leave the console open for 5 more minutes in case you still need to download documents from the resource folder or get your certification of attendance. Bye now.